Hello again, this is Alister McGrath at Oxford University with another short introductory presentation on Christian theology. And this time we are going to reflect on the Christian hope so often expressed in terms of eternal life or heaven. I think one of the most notable features of the New Testament is the importance that it attaches to this idea of hope, even in the face of suffering and death. And as I'm sure you know, at several points in his letters, Paul emphasizes that the coming of Christ has inaugurated a new era, a new age. Something has happened which changes the way we see our world, live within it, and of course, above all, hope for the future. And although Paul believes that this new age has yet to be fully fulfilled, nevertheless, its presence can be experienced by believers in the world here and now. And Paul's point is that the life and death and resurrection of Christ inaugurated something new, something that will indeed find its final consummation in the future, but which impacts on us right now in the present. So if you like, the Christian believer is caught up in the tension between the now and the not yet, between now and the future. And this shapes the way in which Christians think about themselves and their relation to the world. So if you like, this sets a framework for Christian life and thought. Now, Paul often uses the term heaven to speak of the Christian hope, and he seems to understand this term in two slightly different ways. First of all, it refers to the future home of the Christian believer, but it also refers to the present dwelling place of Jesus Christ, from which he will come in final judgment. Now, of course, these may well be the same places, I'm sure they are, but Paul makes a distinction between them. And for Paul, Christians are citizens of heaven. That's Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20. And so in some way, they share in the life of heaven in the present. And the tension between the now and the not yet that I mentioned a moment ago is very evident in Paul's statements concerning heaven. So I think we need to be aware that it's very difficult to sustain the simplistic idea that heaven is something that will not come into being until the future, or which cannot be experienced in the present. You see, the point is that in some way, the future impacts on the present. The hope of heaven shapes the form of Christian life in the here and now. It may be a future reality, but its influence is felt here and now. Now, in the 3rd century, Cyprian of Carthage explored the Christian hope in a very interesting treatise called On Mortality. This was written during an outbreak of the plague at Carthage, when people were dying all over the place. And Cyprian is here reflecting on the fragility of human life and how the hope of heaven gives stability and hope in the face of uncertainties. And at this time, much of the Roman Empire, including the big cities of Rome and Carthage, were afflicted by some kind of pandemic. Now, it may well have been smallpox, and this led to frighteningly large death tolls. In fact, some historians would now suggest that this pandemic actually fatally damaged the Roman Empire, leading to its collapse just over a century later. But in his work on mortality, Cyprian argues that going to heaven is really like returning home. Christians are, he writes, guests and strangers in this world. Believers are passing through this world. They don't really belong here because their real home is in heaven. And for Christians, death marks the process by which this homeward journey is initiated. That's an important point. Heaven is in the future, but we feel its impact right now. And at several points in this treatise, Cyprian refers to paradise as the patria of Christians. And that Latin term, patria, really means homeland or native land. It had rich cultural associations for Roman citizens who might serve in outposts overseas like Carthage, but who hoped to return to their homeland, Rome, in their final days. And Cyprian uses this image of the homeland, or in Latin patria, to make 3 points. First of all, Christians are in exile from their true homeland. This isn't where we really belong. Secondly, Christians have the right to return to their homeland, an idea, of course, which the New Testament expresses in terms of being citizens of heaven. We belong there. And third, Cyprian highlights the emotional aspects of the idea of returning home to emphasize the joy that Christians will experience in heaven. Heaven is about returning home to where we really belong. It's about greeting our fellow citizens of heaven. And that's a very important point. And these ideas were widely accepted within the early Christian community. For Augustine of Hippo, for example, believers live in what he calls an intermediate period, which separates the incarnation of Christ and his final return in glory. The church exists in the world, but you see, it's not of the world. There's a tension between the present situation, the present reality, in which the church is exiled in the world and maintains its distinctive identity while being surrounded by disbelief, and its future hope, in which the church will one day be delivered from the world and finally allowed to share in the glory of God. So Cyprian, I think, gives us some very helpful ways of thinking about heaven and indeed about the Christian hope. And this theme of hope really does remain important for Christian theology. And it's developed, I think, with particular clarity in a document by Benedict XVI, perhaps the most theologically sophisticated recent pope. In 2007, Benedict published his encyclical Spe Salvi. And the Latin title of this encyclical is based on Paul's declaration that in hope we are saved. That's Romans 8:24. Spe Salvi, in hope we are saved. This is one of the most important documents on the Christian hope in recent times, in my view, and it gives a really interesting cultural engagement of secular notions of hope and a restatement, a reaffirmation of the characteristically Christian approach to this theme. So in Spe Salvi, Benedict sets out the Christian hope as something that enables human beings to cope with the ambiguities of human existence. It reaffirms the loving presence of God even in a bewildering world, even in the shadows of life. And Benedict emphasizes that the redeemed life is shaped by faith in, I quote, a God who is not an impersonal and remote first cause of the world. No, the God that Christians believe in entered into our history as a pledge of commitment to us. Now let me give you an idea of what this feels like. I'm going to quote from it and give you a sense of its tone and flavor. This is what Benedict says. The great true hope, which holds firm in spite of all disappointments, can only be God. God who has loved us and who continues to love us to the end, until all is accomplished. That's a very powerful statement, I think. Now, one of the ways in which Christians keep their hope of heaven alive is through worship. There's a very important link between worship and theology. Worship heightens our awareness of the transcendental aspects of life. It's about seeing through and beyond this everyday world to what lies beyond. As you probably know, this is particularly important for the Orthodox tradition, which sees the public worship of the church as kind of drawing close to the threshold of heaven and being able to peer through its portals to catch a glimpse of the worship of heavenly places. In other words, in some way, worship on earth echoes, however faintly, the worship of heaven. It evokes the awesome sense of mystery that we encounter in trying to see God. While on earth, our worship allows us to catch a glimpse of the worship of heaven, in which one day we hope we will all share. Now, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, there's a lot more that I need to say about the Christian hope, but I'm afraid I've run out of time in these short presentations. But I do hope that this sketch map that I've given you in this presentation may be helpful to you as you explore these ideas more fully, perhaps by using some theology textbooks to open up these questions in more detail. And there is much more that needs to be said about this and indeed about every other aspect of Christian theology, such as doctrines of grace, human nature and the sacraments, which I just haven't had time to look at in this brief series of presentations. But listen, you can easily explore these themes using the basic framework that I've provided in these presentations, or by using reliable textbooks to enable you to go deeper. So what am I going to do in the next presentation? Well, look, we've surveyed the main themes of Christian theology. In the next presentation, I'm going to reflect on how we might use theology. In other words, how it can help us to see ourselves and our world through a theological lens rather than simply looking at theological ideas. What way of thinking about ourselves and the world does theology make possible? Theology, if you like, is like a window which enables us to look at ourselves and our world in a new way. So I thought it might be good to explore how we do that and the difference it makes. So I look forward to seeing you again very soon, and thank you so much for listening.